Let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're opening up a seriously fascinating case study in human nature, theology, and honestly the massive danger of making assumptions. We're unpacking chapters 34 and 35 of the book of Job, and we're zeroing in on a guy named Elihu. So Elihu is this bold, outspoken, and, let's be real, overly confident observer who just steps right in to confront Job after Job's older friends have basically thrown their hands up and quit. What makes Elihu so compelling for us to study is that he immediately sets up this profound tension. He proves that just because you have vast biblical knowledge, that absolutely doesn't mean you have the whole picture. As we dig into this, keep in mind that Elihu is about to lay out a highly structured, rigorous theological argument, but it's one that completely misses the mark in how it's applied.
Here's our roadmap for this deep dive. First, Elihu confronts Job. Then, does serving God profit us? Third, God's sovereign impartiality. Fourth, does our behavior affect God? Fifth, finding songs in the night. And finally, number 6, right theology, wrong application. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, Elihu confronts Job, the bold interrogation. We're kicking things off in Job chapter 34. Presenting himself as this confident ally, Elihu actually turns away from Job for a second and demands that Job's friends, the older, supposedly wise men, listen to his specific take on the situation. He's totally hijacking the narrative here, asking them to evaluate his words very, very carefully.
He hits them with this brilliant line, "For the ear tests words, as the palate tastes food." It's such a fantastic analogy, right? He's basically saying, look, we shouldn't just passively let words wash over us. We need to chew on them. Just like your mouth instantly knows the difference between something sweet and something sour, your ear needs to actively discern and evaluate words. You have to separate what is objectively true from what is completely false. It's a rock-solid premise, but as we're going to see, Elihu totally fails to apply the same careful testing to his own assumptions.
Moving to Section 2, does serving God profit us? The first pillar. This argument is rooted in chapter 34, verse 9. Where Elihu levels an incredibly heavy accusation against Job's character and his faith.
Elihu throws out this massive claim. He says, "For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God." That is a devastating charge. He's painting Job as a guy who has just completely thrown in the towel and abandoned the value of having a relationship with his creator.
But hold on a second. Here is the classic straw man reveal. Elihu claims Job says serving God is useless, right? But the reality? Job never actually said that, not once. He was merely expressing this profound, agonizing struggle, trying to wrap his head around why his intense faithfulness hadn't protected him from absolute tragedy. It's actually really similar to Psalm 73, where the psalmist is wrestling with why the wicked seem to prosper while the righteous are suffering. Job wasn't denying that delighting in the Lord is profitable. Elihu just took a genuine, heartbreaking cry of confusion and completely twisted it into a charge of heresy.
Section 3, God's sovereign impartiality, the facts. Now, despite him completely misreading Job, we do have to give Elihu credit for one thing. His foundational theology about God's absolute justice is spot on. Elihu drops some perfectly sound theology here. He rightfully emphasizes that God is never wicked. He never perverts justice. He points all the way back to Genesis 2, reminding everyone that God formed man from dust, and literally, if God were to just withdraw his breath and spirit, humanity would perish in an instant. Our very existence relies entirely on him. On top of that, Elihu notes that God is perfectly impartial. He doesn't play favorites with kings over everyday people, or the rich over the poor, because he made all of them. And beautifully, God defends the oppressed. He actually hears the cries of the afflicted. All of this, incredibly sound orthodox biblical truth.
But here is where things go completely off the rails. Elihu makes this tragically flawed logical leap. He builds his whole case on isolated truths. Step 1, God is perfectly just. Absolutely true. Step 2, Job is experiencing severe suffering. Also undeniably true. Step 3, therefore, Job must be guilty of some hidden sin. And right there is the trap. Elihu assumes that because God is just, Job's specific suffering must mathematically equal secret guilt. It's like he's doing a math equation with half the numbers missing. He takes correct statements, wraps them in a totally incorrect assumption, and entirely misses the wider counsel of God.
Which brings us to Section 4. Does our behavior affect God? The second pillar. In chapter 35, Elihu shifts gears to examine human righteousness and whether our actions can actually, somehow, manipulate the Almighty.
He poses this second major question to challenge the idea that Job's good behavior gives him some sort of leverage over the Creator. Elihu essentially argues that God is entirely self-sufficient. Look, if a person sins, it doesn't chip away at God's sovereign power. And if a person is righteous, they aren't giving God anything he doesn't already have. Elihu makes the fairly accurate point that our human wickedness and our human righteousness mostly just affect other humans, bringing either oppression or blessing to the people around us.
But again, the crucial flaw is his perspective. Elihu views God as this distant, completely unaffected sovereign. Now, technically, he's right that our actions don't threaten God's existence, but he completely misses the heart of the biblical reality. God is not just some cold, impersonal force in the cosmos. He is a deeply personal creator who actually desires our love, our trust, and our devotion. And because he loves us, he's deeply grieved by our sin. Think about Ephesians 4:30, which tells us the Holy Spirit can be grieved. God doesn't need us to survive, for sure, but he desires a relationship with us. That's a massive nuance that Elihu's cold, calculated logic just completely fails to grasp.
Let's look at Section 5, Finding Songs in the Night. We're shifting now to how Elihu addresses the really painful reality of human oppression and those desperate moments when God seems completely silent.
Right in the middle of his rigid arguments, Elihu drops what is honestly one of the most profound thoughts in the entire text. Where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night? He points out that when people are oppressed, they cry out because they're miserable, sure, but they don't necessarily turn to God, the only one who can actually give them real strength. This whole concept of God giving a song in the night is just incredibly beautiful. It reminds us that even in the absolute darkest, most despairing circumstances, kind of like Paul and Silas beaten and singing praises in a midnight prison in Acts 16, God remains totally faithful and can provide this unshakable hope.
But in classic Elihu fashion, he turns around and weaponizes this beautiful truth. He accuses Job of crying out in pride, claiming Job basically said he's never going to see God. But once again, he is falsely accusing him, totally ignoring Job's actual, deeply rooted faith. Earlier in the book, Job literally shouted, "I know that my Redeemer lives," expressing this absolute, rock-solid confidence that he would ultimately see God's justice. Was Job in deep despair? Yes. Did he even wish for death to end his suffering? Absolutely. But he never ever rejected God's ultimate authority or the reality that justice would eventually come.
And that leads us to Section 6, Right Theology, Wrong Application, the third pillar. We finally hit the climax of Elihu's super-structured theological case against Job, where all his flawed assumptions just completely boil over.
He concludes his whole argument with this third question. Basically, because God hasn't stepped in with immediate, blazing anger to judge the situation right this second, Elihu decides Job must just be speaking absolute, rebellious nonsense. He says, "Therefore Job opens his mouth in vain, he multiplies words without knowledge." Elihu is just so blindingly confident in his own take on Job's suffering. He assumes that his limited human perspective is the absolute, unquestionable truth of the universe. So what does this all mean for us? It boils down to this ultimate resolution. God possesses the complete picture, and we simply do not. The entire book of Job proves that Elihu's neat, tidy little theological formulas are just way too simple. Good, righteous people can indeed suffer severe hardships for reasons that God doesn't immediately reveal to them. Job was out there struggling in the dark, just trying to understand God's mysterious purposes. Meanwhile, Elihu made the tragic mistake of confusing his own limited, human understanding with God's infinite, complete knowledge. It's a humbling reminder that God's wisdom is just infinitely greater than ours, and his ways are not our ways.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a challenge. Ask yourself, are we, like Elihu, ever too confident in our own limited understanding of God's mysterious ways? It is just so incredibly easy to take perfectly good theology and weaponize it against someone who is hurting simply because we desperately want their pain to make logical sense to us. So take a minute to examine your own pride today. Let the story of Job and the speeches of Elihu encourage you to trust God's infinitely greater wisdom, his perfectly just character, and his deep, deep love for you, especially on the days when you don't have all the answers. Keep learning, keep questioning, and above all, keep trusting the one who actually sees the complete picture.